Welcome to the electronic archive of presentations from Performance Incentives, the Growing Impact on American K-12 Education, a national conference hosted at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University in 2008. The conference was sponsored by the National Center on Performance Incentives, a research and development center funded in part by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. You're watching a video presentation from Dr. Robert Meyer, a senior scientist at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, on performance measurement strategies used by districts and schools participating in the federally enacted Teacher Incentive Fund program.
Thank you to Vanderbilt for hosting a conference that initially with hopes would be, 100 people, 50, and we have well over 300. This is very interesting. It's very exciting that there might be 300 people that would be willing to be here to listen to us. In 1990, I was on a commission in Wisconsin. The 2000 was way long way in the future at that point, and they asked some of us at Wisconsin, Andy Porter, Bill Clune, myself, to speculate about how we might reform Wisconsin education. And so I developed something that we called a value-added model, and I talked to them about it. I demonstrated it with, demoed it with high school and beyond data, and they said, "That's really amazing. What a shame that we'll never do it." We test students now in third grade, and we probably will cut that soon. So it's very interesting. In a little bit more than a decade, we've moved to a situation, and I'm sure there's pro and con to this, where there's a lot of test data out there. There's a lot of focus on the shift from inputs to outputs, on whether students are doing well. And so it's very interesting. I think there's a number of us working on value-added. Certainly the work has roots in Coleman's work, Rick Hanishek, Renane's work early on. And I still think this is work in progress. We're trying to get better at this, not only from the scholarly standpoint, but from how you do this in an applied sense. We put our money where our mouth is by creating a center at Wisconsin called the Value-Added Research Center. We think just like Jim is studying incentives, we want to approach this as a scholarly topic, find out, can we build models that are as good as possible? Can we find out whether they help teaching and learning? Can kids benefit from this? So let me backtrack and say, where does value-added come from? What's some framework where this can come from? I like to think of at least 4 dimensions to trying to produce some indicators that might be helpful. One is it'd be nice to have multiple indicators. It might be nice if they were in fact not only just based on test scores, but if they are, it might even be nice to have more than one testing system. If I have time, I'll talk about a dual value-added system we're building in Milwaukee based on 2 independent assessment systems. The second thing is we'd like these outcomes to be valid. We can't use a statistical technique to extract meaning from test scores that we don't fundamentally measure the things that we're interested in. And Richard Rothstein and others have talked about, made the correct point that these indicators are going to be only as good as the test scores we start from and other related outcomes. The third thing is we'd like these indicators to be non-corruptible. We'd like them not to be easily manipulated. In some sense, an average test score, if you think of it as an indicator, if you thought of it, I would say incorrectly, as an indicator of school performance, it's highly corruptible in the sense that probably one of the best ways to raise test scores is to just have kids that come in with high test scores to begin with. And so, again, Richard talked about examples where you may succumb to that corruptibility. In any case, I don't think most teachers would succumb to incentives that lead them in the wrong direction, but I don't think it's responsible for us to be building indicator systems that happen to have built-in bad incentives. I just don't think that's good practice. And the fourth thing, and this is really going to be the focus of our paper, is it's a difficult thing. We have to extract value-added from test score data. And it's an extraction problem. It's a signal to noise ratio kind of problem. And we know from the work that Coleman and Rick and Renane and others have done decades ago that much, I guess the word is most, of the variation in test scores as we look at that for 8th graders, 9th graders, 10th graders isn't caused by schools. It's caused by what happens in terms of preschool activities, what parents bring. And so, okay, that's a challenge. That's a challenge for me. That's a challenge for scholars. And there's many of us in the room who work on that. How can we extract meaning, an indicator on value-added school performance or classroom performance or team-level performance from data when there's so many other causes going on? That's why you do value-added, because you want to get it right. So in this paper, it's a technical paper, but to bound it, we split the class of value-added models into two parts, what we call T2 models and T3 plus models. T2 models are models that do as good a job as you can with 2 data points on a kid, and then the T3 plus class of models is fully using the longitudinal data. Many of us in the value-added research world prefer that more general class of models, but we focused on the simpler set here because our goal really in this paper is to speak in some sense to the 17 districts, TIF grantees, who didn't pick value-added. And we want to talk about a progression that would lead people to think about perhaps not using attainment, perhaps moving from gain and proficiency levels to a value-added framework. But we're certainly interested in even the more complex models. But I think it's fair to think that just like as scholars and as practitioners over the decades, we've been involved in a progression. I think some of the districts and TIF grantees and others that get into this are entitled to think of it as a progression where they would get better each year at doing this. And I would argue that they should bring along the stakeholders and the teachers unions and make them partners in actually the design of the models. And we've certainly been doing that in the many districts and state we work with. We think bringing practitioners in on the design of the model is the best PD you could ever get. It's the best way to build trust, and certainly I thank my partners in Chicago and Milwaukee and Minneapolis and elsewhere who've engaged in that process. We find that the superintendent in Milwaukee can speak authoritatively with his board and with his practitioners about what value-added is, and that helps him when he's talking about using it in important ways. So a question that really motivates us, it's either a simple, trivial question, or it's actually a question that provides the whole philosophical organization for our center. And that is, how complex should a model be? And we answer that with simpler is better, unless it's wrong. And actually, there's an insight there, because I think lots of times when we've developed indicators, the world of educational indicators, and Herb, who's written on this, knows well, sometimes they're just there, you make them up, and sometimes you'll throw around the word multiple indicators and know that that blesses the set of them, and out of it comes certainly wisdom. I think we take a harder approach on this, that you need to be very careful as you build these value-added indicators. We're engaging here in something that we think of as basic scientific research. At least we're trying to approximate that when we build a value-added indicator. We're trying to be as close as we can to what you'd get if you did a randomized experiment to produce something that says that teacher, that classroom, that principal, that school did a better job. And of course, we know we're doing that with data that's not perfect. We know we're using quasi-experimental methods. But we take very seriously the notion that when you're maybe going to tell a principal or a teacher that how well they're doing is going to derive from test scores, that it's a very serious enterprise. So I'm both optimistic that this is a good course to take, and at the same time I'm trying to work hard and get it right. And so our paper is in some sense talking about a framework that would help you think about how do you do this? How do you do this? And I remember Rick asked me to write a paper for the National Academy and said, talk about this. Just talk about the logic. Where is this coming from? And that was a good assignment, Rick. Thank you. In a sense, we're doing it again, trying to speak to the logic of what's going on and why there should be a respect for rigor here, and why, over time, you might want to talk to JR and Mr. Sanders and myself and Mike and others about the nuances of getting it right. So what's wrong with attainment? We all know the problem with attainment. Any teacher who's ever been evaluated by a proficiency rate or an NCLB type indicator says, that's not fair. The test scores are always higher in the rich neighborhoods. And of course, what that does is it undermines most of what's interesting about that system. What it doesn't undermine is our goal to have everyone have high attainment. That's, I think, the pearl of NCLB, setting high standards. But it's I would claim, and I think there's people would agree, that there's a field out there. There's a set of logical tools to address the question of how we measure productivity. And attainment is not it. When you measure look at attainment, you're basically getting an 8th grade teacher. That score is going to be almost entirely determined by that score in 7th grade. And so it provides no scope for value-added improvement. That's really undermines trust in the system. The second thing is, which is an interesting question, is the time alignment's all off. You have a really, really good intervention in K through 3, and then 7 years later, your 10th grade test scores are higher, and you go, whoa, thank goodness we did something right in 10th grade, when in fact it was 10 years ago. So the time alignment was all messed up. And one of the papers I cited that actually Rick was part of having me work on, we looked at NAEP data. We tried to look at the nation at risk and find out whether you could tell stories from that. And the stories you would tell by looking at attainment indicators were just wrong. Post-nation at risk, test scores go way up in 11th grade. Value added or gain was actually going slightly down. So you have to not be confused by these things. You can't succumb to the idea that simpler is better, Simpler is better unless it's wrong. Okay, so in our paper we lay out some things that you need to think about. Gain actually can be often quite good, but there are conditions under which gain might be very, very bad, and you need to know those. And Lynn did a good job of summarizing those. Obvious thing is your pre and your post test might be by different vendors. So there's no possibility of doing gain. But for those of us who've been in the field, and that probably includes everybody here, you look at different test companies, the vendors, and the way they psychometrically score tests. And you're amazed. Chicago just switched from the ITBS to the ISAT. Both of them excellent tests. Both of them would claim the property that they're equal interval tests. Yet in one case, we have test scores rising rapidly across grades with massively expanding variance. In fact, some of us weaned on ITBS would say, yes, that's the way the world works. The people who have high test scores increase their lead. That's called the fan-out hypothesis. The ISAT scored with a different scoring algorithm. We have variances not increasing at all. It turns out in those cases that actually gain is a function of your pretest level. So when you do gain, in a case, for instance, where your variances aren't increasing, what you're partly picking up is the negative of prior achievement. And how do you know whether whether you see that or not? If you look at some of the tests that have that most pronounced characteristic, the California Achievement Test Form E, the first test to be scored by IRT, if you looked at gain, it was always highest for the poorest people, for the people that had the most severe special ed handicap. It was highest for the people who were at the lowest starting point. So that's descriptively accurate, but here what we're after is a difference between description and getting at something that reveals something as close as we can to a causal performance indicator. That's what principals, that's what schools, that's what teachers want to be evaluated on, what they cause. So you need to test that. You can't assume that, and so we name some parameters in our paper. We talk about the fact that sometimes that your stock of human capital may not be fully durable, that resources may be given out to schools, to different kids, as a function of their pretest level. All of that messes up the value-added model unless you build it generally enough so that you can control for that. I'll say one last thing. The proficiency, the change in proficiency categories seems like a neat thing because it seems to be getting into gain and value-added type stuff, yet staying within the framework of NCLB. That's pretty neat, actually. So our paper does a lot, and we'll probably add some more to it, about, well, what are the problems there? And the problem is you've taken a test that may have 50 to 100 individual data points, so a fine-grained measurement of achievement, and you've converted it into an extremely coarse-grained measurement, 1, 2, 3, 4, basic, minimum, proficient, advanced. And it turns out you're throwing out tons and tons of information. So Mike and I, using some data sets from some actual districts, said, well, what does that do? We have some graphs in the paper that show how it generates the obvious sort of sawtooth pattern. If you just miss being in a proficiency category, there's very little chance that you're going to make the jump. And so whether you make jumps or not is hugely sensitive to where your kids happen to be, whether they're crossing thresholds. And we also said, well, that's fine, that's the theory. What can we see in the data? And it turns out the correlation between value-added indicators and what I might call proficiency gain indicators can be very, very, very low. And it can be much lower in one subject than another, reading versus math. So while I applaud in some sense the ingenuity of people approaching measurement of gain using gain and proficiency categories, I invite anyone thinking about this, the TIF grantees and others, to think about whether they would start with a value-added model, perhaps even a simpler one. I think the upgrade path for adding features to that is much easier than if you're starting from a system that maybe in some cases close, but very hard to add features. Okay, how complex does it need to be? Well, simple, but unless it's wrong. How can you get it wrong? Well, I work in Wisconsin, I work in Illinois, with Texas data. What do you do when the state assessment's in November or February or January and you're looking at growth from January to January and you want to call that the 7th grade value-added number or the 7th grade gain? I would submit that gain's not even intelligently defined January to January. Now, maybe at the school level, although it's problematic operationally, I think, to respond to that, but not really at the team level and certainly not at the teacher level. So in the value-added system that we built but with Milwaukee, we've, from the beginning, looked at that, in some sense, dual segment growth when you test in the middle of the year. There's lots of local conditions that I think require customization. I don't necessarily believe in the one-size-fits-all. If you test in February, you should think about having that in your value-added model. If you have lots of kids going to summer school, if you have lots of kids in supplemental educational system program, and your signal extraction is about trying to estimate how the teachers are doing in the regular classroom, I invite people to think about doing it the right way, thinking about it. And so there's many of us that are working on trying to provide solutions. In some sense, we're racing one step ahead of the pack here, trying to provide technical solutions to get this right. I don't think it's bad to start with something that's simple. Start the dialogue. I think, as I said at the meeting on value-added this fall, value-added isn't actually about running regressions. It's about engaging in a process of discussion about teachers and principals and administrators becoming more productive and starting to think about their value-added contribution to growth. And I think it's a discussion. I think once you go down that path, the next thing you ask is, oh, my value-added isn't so high. How do I get better? And you're led to other data that might help you think about that. Now, Milwaukee's doing some interesting things. So is Chicago, so is Minneapolis, so is Dallas, a number of districts that we've had discussions with. We might not change the world. We might not improve the quality of education. Let's have some humility. What we're doing in some of these places is running randomized experiments where we are having massive rollout of value-added coupled with extensive professional development that will teach teachers and principals how do you use this stuff, and we're not doing it in some other places. Well, why are we doing that? Because it's hard and expensive and timely to do that. There's a natural opportunity for phasing. There's a natural opportunity for phased experimentation. So do it. Take advantage of it and then contrast. Let's see what it does. There are predictions that it could lead to not teaching enough in science and other things. Let's check, let's track, let's have good fidelity of implementation. Let's see how it changes behavior. Let's look to detect effects on test scores. That's neat. The other thing that we're doing in many districts, I'd like to thank the Joyce Foundation for recently funding this work. They're interested in helping us build dual value-added systems where there's an internal and an external value-added system. An external one tied to accountability indicators, typically state test scores and so on, and then an internal one which is for local internal use, for the use of teachers, for the use of principals. That data not necessarily to be shared, but is there. So the MAP tests, the Thinkling tests out of Vanderbilt here, where you get these tests quarterly. So we're working on that now. It's very interesting, this idea of dual, because I do think this idea of pushing hard, high-stakes indicators, it's something we need to be concerned about. People have talked about that. So at any rate, I invite people to take a look at our paper. We're going to be producing some more. Jim and I and others are part of the Center for Education Compensation Research, and although this conference isn't sponsored by that, our folks with Learning Point and Westat, we're trying to produce papers and documents and handbooks and guidebooks that will help you sort through this stuff. So we invite you to look for our work and also to give us feedback, help us think about it, because this is a very interesting time, and I think we should all be communicating and sharing ideas. So that we're writing a 10-year retrospective view about how we solved the important problems as fast as we could. Thank you.
A working paper and the PowerPoint slides used in this presentation are available on the National Center on Performance Incentive website.